During the 4 years it was fought, it went by many names. The War for States' Rights, Mr. Lincoln's War, the War for Southern Nationality, the War for Separation, the War for Union, the War between the states, the Second War of Independence, the Brothers' War, the Lost Cause. To historians, it became known as the American Civil War, the Civil War for short. Over 100 years later, the Civil War remains the deadliest war ever launched in the Western Hemisphere. It was also one of history's most divisive and disastrous conflicts, tearing a nation apart and pitting brother against brother. A house divided against itself, Abraham Lincoln said, cannot stand. Yet between 1861 and 1865, the American home literally was split in two, and the country torn apart. Americans fought Americans. The lines were drawn roughly between North and South, but conflicting loyalties blurred apparently clear distinctions. Men from the North bid their families farewell and donned Confederate uniforms, convinced that states' rights were endangered by the Lincoln administration. Men from Dixie kissed their mothers goodbye and headed north to join the Union forces, convinced that black slavery could only be removed by force. Even the president himself experienced the war's terrible pull of loyalties. 4 of Lincoln's brothers-in-law enlisted with the Confederates, and the president watched as states such as Kentucky and Delaware contributed equal numbers of willing recruits to both sides. Like so many wars, it started out with flag-waving, drum-beating, boasting, and high expectations. Men flooded recruiting stations, anxious to sign up. They were upset when they were forced to learn basic military drills on parade grounds far from the fighting. They feared that the war would be over before they had their chance to fight and attain glory. But the Civil War lasted 4 years. In the end, the United States lost 5% of its population in the Civil War. Most of the 600,000 killed were mere boys. Victims of the war, along with hundreds of thousands of troops, were the dreams of families from Florida to Maine and from Virginia to California. But out of the ashes arose a better union, changed forever. The end result of the war was the country was no longer one part free, one part slave. But the cost was high. The casualties were enormous, as was the loss and destruction of property. The Civil War officially began on February 12, 1861, when Confederate forces under General B.T. Beauregard bombarded a Union fort in South Carolina's Charleston Harbor. But the tension and deep-seated hostility between the North and South that were the cause of the conflict had been growing for a long time. Long before the Southern states began seceding from the Union and forming the Confederate States of America, there were in fact already 2 Americas, or at least 2 separate cultures, slowly growing apart. The North was a fast-growing urban industrial region. The South, a rural, agricultural, slow-growing region. As the North's population swelled through immigration, the South's remained static. What was good for the North was not always good for the South. The high tariffs on foreign goods set by several administrations in Washington, for example, protected young industries in the North, but hurt Southern cotton growers who were dependent on exporting their cotton and needed to import cheap foreign goods to fulfill their material needs. The Southerners never tired of pointing out that cotton accounted for some 57% of all American exports. High import tariffs in America only invited high tariffs on exported American cotton, prohibiting export and effectively shutting down the Southern economy. Unfortunately, trade policy wasn't the only issue dividing North and South. The connection between cotton and slavery was beginning to weigh heavily on some consciences in the North. During the 1830s and 1840s, opposition to slavery spread throughout the Northeast, and abolitionist societies and newspapers were established in many cities and states. At first, the anti-slavery forces merely opposed the extension of slavery into more United States territory and hoped that the South's dependence on slavery would gradually decline and disappear in the states where it was already established. Over time, however, the abolitionists grew in numbers and their demands became more far-reaching. The problem was that slavery was essential to the Southern cotton industry. When abolitionists such as William Lloyd Garrison called for an end to black servitude, cotton planters heard him calling for the end of their livelihoods. Southerners resented the abolitionists and the sympathetic hearing they seemed to be getting from influential policymakers in the North. Blacks made up 40% of the South's population and were reckoned to be worth some $2 billion to the Southern economy. As the abolitionists raised their voices higher and higher, demanding an end to Southern slavery without ever talking about compensation, Southerners began talking about states' rights as a tactic to protect themselves from the federal government, which they considered a body controlled by hostile enemies. While abolitionists argued that Congress had the duty to prohibit slavery wherever it could, the Southerners demanded not only that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery, but that it had the duty to protect it. The lines were drawn. The growing hatred and suspicion came to a head in 1854 with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. According to the law, citizens in the new states of Kansas and Nebraska would decide for themselves whether they would have slavery or not. The idea of letting the new states decide whether they would allow slavery or not caused a tremendous rush of immigration to the two new territories as pro- and anti-slavery forces attempted to get to the states first. As they scrambled to gain an upper hand, the abolitionists and the Southern sympathizers armed themselves and fought. The territory became known as Bleeding Kansas, as opponents staged raids on one another. It was in Kansas that John Brown, the radical anti-slavery crusader, first attacked a pro-slavery group. At the so-called Potawatomi Massacre, Brown murdered at least 5 Southern settlers. Later, in 1859, Brown attempted to start a slave insurrection by seizing a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry in Virginia and issuing weapons to blacks. Although Brown was quickly forced to surrender, his plot had killed the town's Southern mayor and spread panic in the South. Looking at developments in Kansas and at Brown's actions in both Kansas and Virginia, Southerners feared that their very livelihoods were at stake. They developed a hardline attitude towards slavery and insisted that slavery would either be protected and extended into all new territories, or they would be forced to secede from the Union to protect themselves. When Abraham Lincoln, running on a platform supporting protective tariffs and opposing the extension of slavery, won the 1860 presidential election with a whopping 180 electoral votes, the fears of Southerners seemed to be confirmed. The overthrow of the Southern way of life by Northern agitators appeared to be a real possibility. Based on their fears, the South reacted swiftly to the perceived threat. On Christmas Eve, 1860, South Carolina declared its independence, quickly followed by Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. On the 8th of February, 1861, delegates from the 7 rebel states met in Montgomery, Alabama, and formed the Confederate States of America, electing Jefferson Davis, a former soldier, senator, and Secretary of War as Confederate President. The twin pillars of the new nation were states' rights and the legality of slavery. Attempts to bring the 7 states back into the Union by compromise failed, and the Confederates began seizing federal arsenals and forts in their territory. It was against this background of coming war that Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated as president on March 4th, 1861. As the grim president and his entourage walked towards the White House, onlookers said it seemed more like a funeral than a celebration of victory. Although Lincoln made peaceful overtures to the South on that cold, glum day, his speech was a thinly veiled warning. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, is the momentous issue of civil war. You can have no conflict without yourselves being the aggressor. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. The South ignored Lincoln's warning. Earlier, the Confederate States had resolved to take Forts Sumter and Pickens, the last 2 remaining federal installations in the Confederate States. Major Anderson, the U.S. soldier in charge of Fort Sumter, was asked by the Confederates to surrender the fort. When Anderson refused, the Confederates prepared to bomb him out. On April 12, 1861, at 4 a.m., the first shots rang out in the Civil War as Confederate General B.T. Beauregard pummeled the fort with a massive artillery bombardment. After sustaining 36 hours of shelling, Anderson accepted the terms of surrender offered by Beauregard and marched his men out of the fort. Amazingly, no one on either side was killed during the ferocious cannon fight. It was the last time that would happen. The American Civil War had begun. Many bloody battles would follow. Lincoln responded to the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter by calling for volunteers to serve for 90 days to put down the secessionary movement. Northerners responded to the Confederates' firing on the American flag and to Lincoln's call to arms by flooding recruiting offices. But 4 previously neutral Southern states, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, responded to Lincoln's call by abandoning their neutrality and joining the Confederacy. Papers in the North began calling for a quick drive against Richmond, Virginia, which had been named the capital of the Confederacy. It was clear that the North expected a quick victory. The Confederate war aims were clear. They would attempt to defend their independence. Confederate strategy was clear too. Using the advantage of established defense lines, they would fight off any attempts by Northern armies to enter the South. Over time, Southern leaders argued, the North would be worn down by a war that was too difficult to win. For President Lincoln, the aim of the war was to preserve the Union. His strategy, therefore, had to be aggressive. His armies had to take Confederate territory, defeat Confederate armies, and topple the Confederate government. Toppling the Confederate government in Richmond, a mere 100 miles from Washington, where the Union Army of the Potomac was massing, seemed the easiest and most symbolic move and it was quickly chosen. Lincoln's commander, General Winfield Scott, ordered General McDowell to cross the Potomac into Virginia. He was to seek out the Confederate Army defending Richmond, defeat it, and move on to the capital. So sure were the Unionists that their victory would be swift and decisive that they allowed sightseers to follow them as they hunted down the Confederate forces near Manassas Junction, Virginia. The spectators got a show, but it was not what they expected. The first important battle of the Civil War took place on July 21st, 1861, near a creek called Bull Run. Both armies were badly trained and poorly organized, but the rebels were much stronger than the Union troops expected. If a winner of this battle could be called, it was the South. But as the battle ended, they were no better off than the North. By Civil War standards, the casualties at Bull Run were low, but it was much bloodier than either side had expected. If they knew what was about to happen in the next 4 years of war, both sides might have tried harder to solve their differences with nonviolent compromise.